Welcome to another episode of Daily Musings from Sacred Ground. Sometimes on this program I talk about my work as a storyteller. I've been a professional storyteller for decades. If you have an interest, you can look on the web. There's my website, michaelthestoryteller.com. We also have a couple of other podcast series. The Mindful Storyteller, where my wife Ollie and I talk about storytelling and story listening. And then Michael the Storyteller Tells Tales is another podcast series where I share a number of folk tales and some family stories. I'm interested in how do we bring the sacred to our lives? How do we re-sacralize our lives? And for a long time now, I've thought of that in relation to storytelling and story listening. And back in the 90s and more in the early 2000s, I did a lot of programs in elementary schools where I'd come in, do assembly programs and tell folk tales, share some family stories. Sometimes we do a parents' night program. There were writing workshops, other elements to this as well. And I have these funky pants. Actually, a woman designed the first couple of pair for me that I would oftentimes wear to those gigs. And, to sort of create the excitement for the children, try to make this a fun event. And I'd go into a small town. I recall once, I think it was in Ashtabula, Ohio, and stay at a motel the night before, get up real early in the morning, and I go out to a diner before I go to the school. So it's maybe 6:15, 6:30 in the morning. And in this little town, this guy shows up in these wild clothes. And I sat down at the stool there, ordered some, toasted eggs, and the fellow next to me, he, of course, everybody saw the clothes, but he had the gumption to actually say something. It's like, notice your pants there, or something like that. And so I try to explain to him, and I say, I'm an educator. I was a school teacher. Now I'm a storyteller. I go in to schools and tell stories, folk tales, some family stories, sometimes a story from children's literature, and help to get the children excited about books, about reading, about using their imagination, telling their own stories. And this guy, he proceeds to tell me a little story. And he's probably in his 60s or 70s. And if I recall, I think he worked in the steel mill, maybe Youngstown Sheet and Tube, where my father worked as well. And he tells me about when he was a kid, he'd go over to his grandma's house. And he said, in her closet, my grandma had this paper bag. And if I looked like I was bored or something like that, she'd say, Robert, go get the bag out of the closet. And I'd go and I'd get this big shopping bag. And she'd say, shake it up. And I'd shake it up. And then she'd say, okay, go ahead, pick one out. And I'd reach inside. And this guy says to me, he says, you know what that was? And I didn't know. It was a bag full of old photographs. And so I'd reach in and I'd pull out one. And it might be a picture of me when I was 4 years old, or it might be a picture of my parents when they were first dating, or my dad when he was a teenager, or my grandma when she was a lot younger, or somebody else that I didn't know or barely knew. But what my grandma would then do is she'd sit next to me on the couch and she'd tell me a story that went with that picture. Stories, storytelling, story listening. Another way to help, I think, re-sacralize our lives. I'm Michael Malley, and you've been listening to Daily Musings from Sacred Ground.